In this series, we're going to talk about the endocrine system, or you may know it as the hormonal system. This is categorized as our slow chemical communication systems, whereas neurons are neurochemical, meaning that they send electrical as well as chemical signals through their neurotransmitters. Endocrine system is going to have a very, very slow system in that it secretes these hormones into the bloodstream, and then eventually that bloodstream has to circulate throughout the body in order for these hormones to take effect. But even though this is the slow communication system, it is also the longer lasting communication system. So even though hormones take longer to circulate throughout the body, they are going to have much longer lasting effects than other neurotransmitters, or simply just your neurons firing and communicating with each other electrochemically. Okay, so when we look at the different glands, okay, the different neurotransmitters or hormones that are released, the first one we're going to talk about is the pineal gland. This is the part of the endocrine system that's going to deal with sleep due to its release of a hormone known as melatonin. So y'all may already be familiar with this particular hormone because you can see it in any pharmacy or drugstore. It's over the counter. You can take melatonin gummies. For some people, it works really well where they take an extra amount of this hormone and then it helps them get to sleep faster, or it helps them sleep longer. For other people, like for myself, I've tried melatonin before and didn't really notice much of a difference. And so that's when you have to move on to asking your doctor about other options. But with this, melatonin is a natural hormone that occurs in your body, and your pineal gland is the thing that releases it into your blood system. And so you all probably notice that as teenagers, you want to sleep in late and you want to stay up late. And that's partially because at your age range, your pineal gland is sending out these melatonin hormones at a much later time in the day, and they are stopping their release at a much later time in the morning. And so that's why you feel this need to stay in bed longer or to stay up till 2 a.m. Okay, for some extent, you can get into the argument of nature versus nurture. There's some people who are like, oh yeah, absolutely not, I'm a morning person. In which case I'm like, okay, well, keep that to yourself because I am not a morning person whatsoever. But you can fight against that melatonin, but it's just at y'all's age, that's one more obstacle for y'all to have to overcome. Whereas at my age, I'm getting very, very accustomed to feeling tired earlier in the evening and being able to wake up naturally earlier in the day as opposed to my teenage years. Okay, the next gland that we're going to look at is the pituitary, which is one of the most important parts of the midbrain. It's called the master gland because it controls so much of our behavior. So y'all may remember when we talked about hunger versus satiety, the feeling of being hungry or the feeling of being full. We talked about specific parts of the hypothalamus that were involved with this. The hypothalamus, we're looking at either the lateral hypothalamus, which I abbreviate as LH, or the ventromedial hypothalamus, which I abbreviate with VH, or you may sometimes see it abbreviated as VMH. Okay, so remember that the lateral hypothalamus tells you that you are hungry. So that is going to tell you like, hey, you need more nutrients. If it's damaged, then you'll never feel hungry. So you will lose weight, versus your ventromedial hypothalamus, which tells you that you're full. So if your ventromedial hypothalamus is damaged, then you will never stop eating, just keep gaining weight and keep eating and eating because there's nothing in your brain telling you to stop. Okay, so you could be also getting social cues that are getting you to eat more. Like if you're hanging out with friends, typically eating is a part of our social dynamic, and so that can be a factor as well. Well, how does this relate to the pituitary gland? The hypothalamus communicates with the pituitary gland. So since it signals the pituitary gland, that's where we have that connection between the hypothalamus and the LH and the VH and the pituitary gland. All right, so this gland here is responsible for human growth hormone. So it starts releasing human growth hormone when you're going through puberty, which is why, sometimes y'all go home after freshman year and you're gone for a summer and then you get back and you're like 2 feet taller. And I'm like, how did this happen? You were like so little last time I saw you and I taught you, and now all of a sudden you're grown. Okay, that could be because of your pituitary gland finally kicking into gear and saying, okay, human growth, let's go. Next, with your thyroid, which is in your neck, you'll notice that this is kind of like a butterfly-shaped gland. Your thyroid is responsible for releasing thyroxine. Okay, and this deals with metabolism. Okay, so you may have heard of hypothyroidism or hyperthyroidism. If it's hypo, that means low, not enough. And so if you have hypothyroidism, that means that your metabolism is going to be slow. So what does that mean? You're going to eat and you're going to rapidly gain weight because your metabolism is not burning off of that energy as much. And so some issues with weight gain could be related to this particular gland. And so it's very difficult to kind of narrow down because earlier we were saying, oh, your hypothalamus could be affected. Well, it could be your hypothalamus, but it could also be your thyroids. And so there's a lot of different variable factors that we have to consider, or that doctors at least have to consider when they're trying to narrow that down. Whereas if you have hyperthyroidism, that's when your metabolism goes into overdrive. So you may be able to eat and eat and eat and never gain weight, and you're constantly tired and exhausted. And at some points, like your hair may start falling out because you're not getting enough nutrients and things of that nature. And so those are some symptoms that could be related to issues with your thyroid and the amount of thyroxine that you have. And that can be treated with medication. Next, with the adrenal glands. Your adrenal glands are responsible for releasing, obviously, adrenaline. This is an energy hormone. Okay, so if you go into fight or flight, right, y'all may have heard of some stories where like a mom has to lift a car off of her baby or something, or it's like, how could a human possibly lift a car all by themselves? Well, it's because they have that adrenaline rushing through them, or epinephrine, that gives them that extra boost in order to act on that behavior. You may also know that epinephrine is used for people who are having allergic reactions, and so it kind of helps open the blood vessels, and so that's part of the reason that it helps with allergic reactions, is that kind of helps get that stuffiness out so like your throat doesn't close up. Same thing with adrenaline, high energy. And then moving on to the gonads. Okay, and we are going to use technical terms, especially when we talk about things like this. And so this is the same as if you're taking AP biology or an anatomy class. We are going to have to talk about hormones that relate to reproduction or sex drive. Okay, so obviously with the typically female associated, or so if you're talking about female sex, not so much gender, but if you're talking about the female sex, you're going to see that the gonads are ovaries, whereas with the male sex, the gonads are testes. And so what's interesting about this is that in the womb, you don't really know whether a child is going to present as male or female until the ovaries either remain within the body or if they drop and become external. Okay, so these are the same type of gonads. At some point in the development in the womb, they are going to change their function. Okay, so the ovary is going to be associated more with estrogen and progesterone, which are often used in birth control in order to control the menstrual cycle, because these hormones are very important for menstruation and the thickening of the endometrial lining within the uterus, as well as with pregnancy. All right, and so these are basically following into the category of hormones known as gonadotropins. Okay, so gonadotropins, these are essential for reproduction. They're not essential for life. In fact, we are going to find that some people with certain chromosomal abnormalities aren't able to reproduce. They are going to be infertile because of some issues with these release of gonadotropins. But this is essential for reproduction. But you don't need them to live. Like, say, for instance, you would need your pituitary gland hormones or your thyroxine or things like that. Another androgen that we're going to look at is testosterone, which we typically associate with the male sex. Okay, and so that's also going to be essential for reproduction. Although it's important to note that these aren't exclusive to certain biological sexes. You're not going to find that only women have estrogen or that only men have testosterone. You have different levels of each. So women tend to have higher levels of estrogen because, you have to account for menstruation and pregnancy, but it is going to be present in men to a certain degree, and same thing vice versa with testosterone. Another hormones that are related to the sex drive and reproduction include oxytocin, which y'all may be familiar with as the love hormone. It's released when women have babies. It's released when they have skin-to-skin contact with their child after birth. But it's also called the cuddle hormone because it relates to that same drive in terms of a sex drive. And then you also have vasopressin, which plays some role, although it's more so associated with the maintaining of homeostasis or balance within your body in terms of fluids, like, your sodium versus your water levels. But it is also associated with this because all drives, according to the drive theory, have to deal in some form or fashion with homeostasis or that maintaining a balance of the drive. So again, we've covered hunger and satiety with the hypothalamus, whether it's lateral or ventral medial. That signals the pituitary gland, which relates to human growth. Your pineal gland deals with sleep and the release of melatonin. Your thyroids deal with your metabolism, whether you have a high or a low metabolism. And then your adrenal glands deal with your fight or flight, like giving you that boost of energy. Your pancreas, we didn't talk about that, produces insulin, and that is essential to life. So if it regulates the sugar levels in your blood, so your blood sugar levels. And so while we are going to see that some of these hormones are not essential to life, things like insulin very much are. And in fact, we've managed to patent a way to manufacture insulin to help treat childhood diabetes so they can extend the lifespan on that. And then lastly, we talked about gonads and gonadotropins, how it relates to sex characteristics with estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, and then of course, oxytocin and vasopressin. Okay, so hormones are like neurotransmitters. It's just that they are much slower. They're produced in one tissue, but you're going to see that they don't just affect the tissue in which they were created, but then they go out into the bloodstream and they move throughout the body, having an effect on a wide range of the body rather than just one targeted area. And one thing that is important to note is that this endocrine system is slow but long-lasting. So we communicate electrochemically through our neurons. That's very, very fast. That's how we decide to move and lift our arms or walk. But when it comes to a longer lasting communication, a chemical communication, that's when we're looking at hormones. And so it would make sense that, yeah, we don't want just chemical messengers for things that we have to do that are rapid, like moving. But when it comes to puberty, when it comes to long-lasting cycles like menstruation, then obviously you're going to want a steady level of hormones being released and moved through the blood system in order to regulate those functions. Your adrenal glands, above the kidneys, above the pancreas, those are going to release adrenaline, norepinephrine, that's a fun word to say, and epinephrine, which help us in our fight or flight. Heritability. So how do you inherit these traits? Well, heritability is the amount of difference between individuals based on the genes that you have inherited. Okay, so it's important to note that this is the amount of difference. So the heritability of any given trait in identical twins is 0 because they have the exact same gene code. They came from the same egg and from the same sperm, and just at some point within fertilization, that zygote split, creating two identical people in terms of their genes. All right, so this isn't accounting for any of the nurture aspect of psychology. This is purely looking at the nature argument. Okay, they are born exactly the same. They are identical, even down to their chromosomes. The heritability of any trait, whether it's your intelligence or your attitude or your height, that's going to be lowest. So you see that heritability is 0 with identical twins. It makes sense that it would be lowest amongst genetically similar individuals that are then raised in dissimilar environments. So this is when we get into the nurture part of the debate. Okay, so are people born that way or are they made that way? In reality, it's going to be a combination of both. Okay, it's going to be both nature and nurture. It's going to be the genes that you inherit plus the circumstances of your life that play a role on your behavior and your cognition. All right, further in this crash course in genetics, we're going to look at chromosomal abnormalities. Okay, so for instance, our biological sex is determined by our 23rd pair of chromosomes. So we get 23 from each parent that combines to a total of 46 chromosomes. All right, typically men have the chromosomes that help determine whether a baby displays as male or female. Okay, so the X chromosome is going to be associated with females. The Y chromosome is going to be associated with males. So the woman is going to be given an X no matter what. That baby is getting an X chromosome. What determines whether that baby is going to be male or female presenting is going to be whether the male gives another X or if the male gives another Y. This is just basic biology. So if you've already taken AP Bio or you're currently in the process of taking AP Bio, this should sound very, very familiar. Now, occasionally, these chromosomes are going to combine in unusual ways that result in some abnormalities, right? So when we talk about Turner's syndrome, this is something that's present only in women, okay? So if you see this symbol here, this is just shorthand for women. This is shorthand for male. So only in women, you're going to have a missing X chromosome. So they have one. You're supposed to have two, but with Turner's syndrome, they ended up only having the one. So as a result, you're missing chromosomes. You're missing genetic information that helps determine your phenotype. Okay, that helps determine what your physical characteristics are going to be. And so typically people with Turner syndrome have a shorter height. They have underdeveloped ovaries. That's going to make it very, very difficult, if not impossible, for them to reproduce. And then also, to add on to that, they can also have symptoms of heart defects. Okay, so it's very important that you get these chromosomes because they play such a strong role in your phenotype, which is how you physically, okay, so I think P, physically, phenotype, physically present. Next, Klinefelter's syndrome. This is where you have males, this is a male chromosomal disorder, where they have an XXY. So whereas they're supposed to have or normally have an XY pairing, they're going to have an extra X chromosome. So they'll have two or more X chromosomes. Sometimes you can have XXXY. And men with Klinefelter syndrome are going to suffer from or deal with infertility, small testes. So like we saw here in Turner syndrome, there's underdeveloped ovaries. We're going to have the same thing with underdeveloped gonads in the form of testes for men with Klinefelter syndrome. They are going to be taller than average. So whereas the Turner syndrome, women are shorter than average, under Klinefelter's, they're going to be taller than average, but they can also sometimes develop breast tissue, which is typically more associated with the female gender. So you have infertility, small testes, taller than average, possibility of developing mammary tissue, and so you are going to have physical characteristics that are associated with these genotypes. Okay, so genotype is the genes that you have. And then that plays a role that determines, to a large extent, your physical traits, your phenotype. You've probably been familiar with the chromosomal abnormality of Down syndrome. So like we said before, you typically get 23 chromosomes from each parent. That equals a total of 46. Well, with Down syndrome, there is an extra chromosome. And so with that extra chromosome, you do have characteristics like different motor movement, different appearance, different phenotypes that develop as a result of that extra chromosome. Although this is the most common of the chromosomal abnormalities in the United States. I think it's 1 out of every 700 babies is born with Down syndrome. All right, so how do we combine genotype with phenotype? How do we make that connection? Well, a Punnett square, which if you've taken AP Bio or you're currently in AP Bio, should sound very familiar with. A Punnett square can tell you, based on the genotypes you have, what the phenotype might be. So based on genotype, you can have dominant or recessive genes, and how those genes combine can help determine the physical attributes of the offspring, because the genotype is the genetic makeup, whereas the phenotype is the physical traits. So how I remember this is I think P physical, P phenotype, gene, genetic, genotype. That's how I remember those. So here we have big B, because brown eyes are dominant, versus little b, which is blue eyes, which are recessive. So if you go down this Punnett square, so if we look at big B, little b for this category right here, what is big B, little b? Well, even though the genotype is mixed, you have a dominant and a recessive, the dominant is going to overrule the recessive, and so it's still going to be brown. Big B, same thing, brown. Big B, brown. Big B, brown. So no matter what, based on these genotypes, 100% of the offspring from these two people, the blue-eyed person and the brown-eyed person, are going to have brown eyes. Let's see how that would work if we were doing big B, little b, big B, little b. So if we draw out our Punnett square, and if you can't tell, this is one of my favorite parts of AP Bio because it's just one of those things that stuck with me. I'm going to put big B, little b, big B, little b. Well, here in this first category, we're going to have big B, and that equals brown. Then we're going to have little b, big B. Then here, big B, little b. And then here, little b, little b. So what does that tell us in terms of phenotype? Well, we know that this portion is brown. This is brown, and this is brown. So out of 100%, 75% are going to have brown eyes. But there's a 25% chance that one of their offspring could have blue eyes because of that recessive, those double recessive. If you have little b, little b, little b, little b, then of course that's going to be 100% blue eyes no matter what, because it's going to be those recessive genes put together. So you can do this with a lot of different characteristics. Some are a little bit more difficult because you have to get into the difference between recessive and dominant, but this is just a quick cursory overview of what that would look like in, say, a basic biology class or even more detail in a AP bio class. When it starts getting into 14 or I think it's 16 squares on a Punnett square, that's where I'm going to tap out. I'm going to stick with this simple 2x2, 4 boxes. That's what I'm most comfortable with. All right, at this point in the lecture, if you so choose, you have the option to watch this 7-minute brain dissection video. If you are a little bit more queasy, then it's perfectly fine for you not to watch this video. And if instead you want to just base your knowledge of the brain off of our lectures, that's fine. But if you do want some extra material, this is available for you. All right, real quick, let's do a review with our limbic system. Remember that that limbic system is involved in emotions. And so I'm going to show you a picture, and you're going to have to tell me the part of the limbic system that is related to it. Okay, so looking at this first picture, I would associate this picture with fear, although it's very clearly faked fear. And we're going to start talking about micro expressions and things like that when we get further into our curriculum. But with this expression of fear, all right, this expression of, oh, I'm going to fight or flee, what part of the brain would we associate that with? If you said the amygdala, then you would be exactly right. Okay, so excellent. Pat yourself on the back. All right, what about this photo? Okay, clearly we have somebody who has a very delicious looking burger. But if I'm going to be honest with myself, I could probably live off that burger for a week, like just bringing it every day to school for my lunch and just popping it in the microwave. Okay, in one sitting, that is not about to happen. And so what do we associate, in what part of the brain in the limbic system do we associate with feelings of hunger or satiety? If you thought hypothalamus, then you would be correct. Remember that there are two parts. You have the lateral hypothalamus, and you have the ventromedial hypothalamus. This, I don't know if this will culturally relate because I know I'm getting older, so I know that what this is. Like you would put a ribbon on your finger to remind you of something. Back in my day, we would write on our hand what our homework was, and then our parents would tell us, oh, you're going to get ink poisoning. But I think that was more of a scam just to get us to stop drawing on each other in Sharpies. But basically, this is just a way to remind yourself. Nowadays, y'all have apps, literally apps like Remind, or you have your Google Calendar, or you can set alarms, and so this may not be, as clear of a picture. But this is basically saying, what do you associate with memory? So if you said hippocampus, you would be exactly right. Last picture. Here we have somebody who has had a lot of growth hormone, very, very tall. All right, like when we think Andre the Giant, we think of gigantism. So what part of the body, what gland is responsible for the amount of growth hormone that you have in your bloodstream? If you said pituitary gland, then excellent. That is exactly what relates to growth. Oh, I also want to remind you as a review, lateral deals with hunger. Ventromedial deals with satiety, with fullness. For the last part of this section of the lecture, here's a 9.5-minute video, very funny video, at least the guy who's presenting it. I can't get over looking at his hair. But this is a very interesting video because it covers lobotomies. And so this goes into the concept of psychosurgery. Okay, which typically you think of like, oh, okay, if there's a tumor, then obviously if you have a tumor in your brain, you may have to undergo psychosurgery. But this goes into a little bit more of an extreme. Okay, and it's also going to talk about if we are looking at damage or lesions caused to the brain, that's often called an insult. So not just in terms of hurt feelings, an insult to the brain is talking about lesions or damage. And sometimes in psychosurgery, there's treatment for certain disorders, certain treatment that was used for certain disorders, ablation, which is the removal or destruction of part of the brain. So you remember from our lectures with split brain, that was the destruction of the corpus callosum. So cutting off that tie between the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere that could help treat seizures, and which in some cases, in extreme cases, is still used. Electroshock therapy can be used for treatment-resistant depression, although sometimes you've heard of it used in other off-label methods, like with people trying to quote-unquote treat or cure homosexuality, although the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, says like, no, that is absolutely not a mental disorder, and so you should not be using electroshock therapy for it, but it is used for treatment-resistant depression. Okay, so in some cases, electroshock therapy could be useful for that. Or if you are, say, performing a lobotomy, where this is the destroying of the connection between the frontal lobe and the rest of the brain. And so I would highly, highly recommend watching this video because it does have like this interesting discussion of this extreme form of psychosurgery and its impact on thousands of people, including even the Kennedy family. There was the sister of John F. Kennedy was treated with a lobotomy because she had some difficulties when she was born. When her mother was in labor with her, the nurses had shown up, but the doctor hadn't. And so the doctor couldn't accept pay unless he was there for the birth. And so if the baby had been born prior to the doctor arriving, then he would have been out of pay. And so what the nurses did in order to fix this dilemma was they didn't let JFK's mother deliver the baby. They instead essentially pushed the baby back into the birth canal, which obviously led to damage. You have the cutting off of oxygen, and so that led to developmental delays in his younger sister. And so as a result, this was considered very shameful within this, this political family that had a lot of power and a lot of influence, and she was just basically kind of kept away from society. She could read and write, still very childlike in some instances, but they tried to keep this on the down low. Well, until she started hitting puberty and started getting more, resistant to authority and to control and wanted to go out and live her life, as most teenagers do, in which case the patriarch of the Kennedy family decided that drastic measures were needed. And so she was forced to undergo a lobotomy. And as a result, she lost her ability to read and write and even to most extents speak. And so this lobotomy actually made her life decline as opposed to improve it. And so it's always supposed to be the aim of any medical intervention to improve the life standing of a patient rather than to decrease it. And so that's just one anecdotal story to kind of relate it not only to psychology, but also to history.